Defense News is proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, the military's largest force faces an imminent vaccine deadline. Find out how the Army is handling the issue. And a new study shows that military members and vets can be particularly susceptible to scams. Get the details on how you might get targeted. Plus, we learn which country the UAE is negotiating with to provide its fighter aircraft, and the latest on the Russian buildup on the Ukrainian border. Those stories and a lot more on this week's episode. It's the latest news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon here on Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Daniel Woolfolk. We start this week with the latest headlines from around the military, beginning in Syria. U.S. forces in that country recently conducted their first Bradley patrol mission on a road running from Al-Hasaka to Deir ez-Zor. The patrol was composed of 6 Bradley armored vehicles and a Humvee, and they were accompanied by the Syrian Democratic Forces, otherwise known as SDF. The mission is part of the joint steps to enhance the protection of prisons that contain thousands of leaders and members of the Islamic State group. SDF representatives have said the movement is also aimed at combating Islamic State cells that have recently increased their activities in the area. Kurdish authorities operate more than 24 detention facilities scattered across northeastern Syria, holding about 10,000 IS fighters. Among the detainees are some 2,000 foreigners whose home countries have refused to repatriate them, including about 800 Europeans. And now over to the NATO region. Satellite images taken over the past months are said to show the buildup of Russian troops near the Ukrainian border, amid Western concerns that the military concentration could herald plans by the Kremlin to attack its neighbor. Maxar Technologies on Sunday released the images, which were taken between October 18th and November 26th in both Russia and Crimea. U.S. intelligence officials have determined that Russia has massed about 70,000 troops near its borders with Ukraine and has begun planning for a possible invasion as early as next year. Moscow has denied hatching plans to attack Ukraine and rejected the Western concerns as part of efforts to smear Russia. Mistake. That's the word the United States envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking, used to describe the decision to shut down a United Nations investigative body to gather and preserve evidence of human rights violations.
We thought it was a mistake that that there were such votes against its existence, and we'd like to see it reinstated.
The UN Human Rights Council voted in October to shut down its investigations into the atrocities in Yemen. More than 60 organizations have urged the UN General Assembly on December 2nd to once again establish the investigative body. Lenderking echoed those sentiments in a December 3rd panel discussion hosted by the Italian government.
I mean, obviously, when we're talking about accountability in this conflict, there is accountability on all sides that needs to be upheld. And so when we talk about, human rights concerns, and we write about this in our annual human rights report, there are human rights violations on all sides, and they do need to be documented.
Yemen has been gripped by civil war since 2014, when Iran-backed Houthi rebels took control of the capital Sana'a and much of the northern part of the country. That forced the internationally recognized government to flee to the south, then to Saudi Arabia. The organization said that the Human Rights Council vote in October was the result of an aggressive lobbying campaign by Saudi Arabia, backed by the United Arab Emirates, among others. But the foreign minister for Yemen's internationally backed government, Ahmad Awad bin Mubarak, argued at the discussion in Rome that the use of a UN expert panel was, quote, not a good model. He added that it created competition between international and local investigations. That comes as a Saudi-led coalition fighting Iran-backed rebels in Yemen are accelerating airstrikes in the Yemeni capital. The escalation of fighting in recent weeks comes as the rebels repeatedly push back against diplomatic efforts by the UN and the United States. The International Organization for Migration said last month that more than 45,000 people in the Aarp province have been forced to leave their homes since September, including many for the fourth or fifth time since the beginning of Yemen's war. And finally, this week marks the first major deadline for the military's largest force to vaccinate its members. Defense News Weekly's Andrea Scott talked to reporter Davis Winke about the complex and evolving situation as the Army looks to continue the battle against COVID-19.
As the military's largest force, the Army faces a particularly complex challenge in trying to implement its COVID-19 vaccination requirement. I'm joined by reporter Davis Winke to talk about what's coming up. Davis, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Andrea.
Of course. The Army's vaccination deadline is fast approaching on December 15th. What are things looking like in the Army?
So for the active duty force, it's looking pretty good right now. 96% of the Army's nearly 500,000 active duty service members have either completed the vaccine or started it. And it looks like it's going to be about on track with what the other services have seen so far when it comes to active component declinations.
So to be clear, this is the Army active duty deadline. Why is this last compared to the other service branches? And what are we looking at for the Army Reserve and National Guard?
So the reason why it's last just has to do with the Army being the biggest service and having the most people it needs to reach. As for the National Guard and Army Reserve, the reasons that senior leaders have been giving is that the footprint of those units is just really distributed throughout the country. You've got some states in the Midwest where every small town has its own National Guard armory with 30 to 40 troops stationed there. It takes a lot to make the vaccine available for those service members sometimes. And that's why senior leaders wanted to give extra time to make sure that all the soldiers had every opportunity in order to ensure that those declining it are actually declining it.
Okay, so let's talk about those declining it. What has happened to those who have already declined it, and what will happen to those who do decline it?
So on November 16th, Army Secretary Christine Wormuth put out a memo ordering commands to flag service members who have outright denied the vaccine and don't have any exemption pending. What a flag means is that they can't get awards, they can't get PCS'd, they can't get promoted. Basically, their entire careers are on hold until either they get out or until they decide to get the vaccine and become unflagged. That same memo also provided guidance to bar those service members from re-enlistment. You know, when their contracts run out, that's it. And even with that said, the Army, in one of its earlier orders about enforcing the vaccine mandate, said that on order, commands need to be prepared to initiate involuntary discharges of service members who refuse the vaccine. Now, the Army is hesitant to tell me when or even confirm that phase 2 of the operation, which is involuntary discharges, will occur, but that's still hanging out there. They could just pull the rug out from all of these service members as soon as December 15th or maybe the next morning.
So just to confirm, as soon as December 15th, soldiers could be booted out of the Army. And what else do we know about the timeline and the enforcement of that?
So it's complicated because the Army has told commands to be ready to do it, but they haven't yet established A, whether they're actually going to kick all of these soldiers out of the Army, or B, when that's going to happen. It's marked in an early order about the vaccine rollout as being on order, which means that they're just waiting for the word.
So as far as the Army, are there any other legal implications we should be looking at?
So there are some service members who have been suing the Defense Department because they say that, hey, I've previously had the virus. Why should I have to get the vaccine if I have natural immunity? There's a couple issues with that. One is that the CDC still recommends that people who have had the virus get the vaccine. And two is that the DoD requirement is pretty clear that people who have had the virus still need to get the vaccine to comply with this mandate. Those lawsuits are still playing out, though, and there's been no indication from judges yet that they're going to issue any kind of injunction that would temporarily block the mandate for those soldiers.
I'm sure you've talked to some soldiers on the ground. How is this affecting morale, whether positive or negative? What are they saying about this mandate?
You know, it's really split along political lines. You know, there's some soldiers who believe strongly in personal choice, and You'll have some soldiers who will say, I got the vaccine, but I don't think it's right that the Army is forcing people to get it. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of people who are saying, hey, this is a readiness issue, especially in case of deployments. You can't even take the smallest risk that a bunch of service members could potentially get sick and potentially need medical care that diverts valuable battlefield resources. There's some competing arguments here, but ultimately, though, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has been crystal clear about what the rules will be.
So Davis, as the first deadlines hit, what will you specifically be looking for?
Obviously, the first thing is knowing how many soldiers have outright declined, how many exemptions have been approved. As of December 2nd, the Army has approved 3 permanent medical exemptions and 0 permanent religious exemptions. I'll be interested to see where those numbers are in order to get a better sense of, how many service members could potentially be facing discipline or discharge as a result. The other thing I'm going to be looking for is the Army's previously said that commanders, senior enlisted leaders in nominative positions are going to face immediate relief once they've refused the vaccine. I'm going to want to know how many of the Army's battalion commanders, brigade commanders, and all the way up the chain have declined the vaccine, and whether that's going to have any kind of impact on the Army senior leadership ranks.
Well, thank you, Davis. We know you'll be watching closely, and we look forward to hearing your updates and sharing them here on Defense News Weekly.
Thanks, Andrea. When we come back, we look at ways troops and vets can protect themselves from scams that target the military community. A new report from the Aarp shows that members of the military and veterans are targeted by scams at a higher rate than civilians. And I'm currently joined by Troy Broussard, coming to us from Aarp in Louisiana. Troy, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me here today, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you. And tell us a little bit about the study.
Absolutely. Back on November 9th, 2021, Aarp, we released a new survey that really focused on measuring the number of scams and fraud and identity theft schemes that are threatening veterans and active service duty members. And what we found was that veterans and military adults are 40% more likely to lose money to scams and fraud than civilians. And additionally, 4 out of 5 military or veteran adults were targeted by scams directly.
Why are members of the military and veterans being targeted?
So, for example, and I'm a proud Desert Storm veteran from 1990. And what scammers will do, they know that veterans have a sense of community, a sense of service and giving back. So they'll use military jargon to relate to the veteran. Then once that veteran is relatable, then that's where the scam comes in. And then that's where they're looking to get personal information, credit card information, social security number. And that's where identity theft starts. And that's where they can run up large charges on credit cards against our veterans. Again, scamming individuals like that or victimizing our veterans who have served our country.
It's unfortunate that somebody is targeting the sense of community within the military that we all cherish so much. Do you have any idea where that's coming from, where the scams are coming from?
Some of the key findings that we found, a lot of the scams that we look for, that we found in this report, was that military and veteran adults reported losing more money than civilians in these grandparent imposter scams, more than twice as often. These financial phishing schemes as well. And, nearly half of military veterans adults reported that they are not using a robocall blocking service or have not registered their numbers with a do not call registry. This can impact that. So that's some of the things that we want to do to protect the veterans and their families, is to make sure that you have those items in place so that you can prevent these calls from coming in and being a victim from these scammers.
What kinds of stories are you hearing from veterans?
The stories that we're hearing it's shameful. What we hear is that we have veterans that are being targeted around veteran scams, veteran charity scams. So what will happen is a scammer will call the veteran up, call them and state to them, you know what, here's a wonderful opportunity for you to give back now that you're back in your civilian life. Here's a veteran charity that we can go ahead and, get your credit card number. We can go ahead and really give back to, for example, homeless veterans or something along those lines. Immediately, once that credit card information is taken, they'll verify their social security number. So now there's an opportunity for identity theft as well. So it's almost like a double exposure for the veterans because they really just want to give back and really support their fellow veterans.
And as we've spoken, you said that they're not only targeting veterans, they're targeting active military members and their families. So if you're part of any of these groups, what should you do to protect yourself?
To protect yourself, there's 3 things that I would like to recommend to all of our listeners today in the audience. The first thing I would recommend is be calm when you receive these types of calls. Relax. Don't get at a heightened state because that's what the scammers are focused on you to victimize you. They want to focus you in that area. So be calm. And of course, Daniel, develop a no script. No, I'm not interested. Make sure that we develop that no script so you're ready to hang up the phone call and stop this from happening immediately. And then lastly, I would ask that folks, please report these potential scams to the AARP Fraud Watch Network, and that they can be reached at 1-877-908-3360. We have trained volunteers that are there to receive the report. And this allows AARP to share this information with members all across the United States. So this is a great way for veterans and their families to give back and support and prevent other veterans from being victimized.
And Troy, you have mentioned that it not only targets military veterans, but active military and their families. So if anybody's in part of these groups, where should they go for information?
Yes, the best place for veterans, current military and their families to go to, I would recommend that they go to, for the latest fraud and scams, visit aarp.org/veterans. It's a free one-stop tool resource that folks can utilize to protect themselves. And then they also can call the AARP Fraud Watch Network helpline at 1-877-908-3360. And lastly, they can sign up for our free watchdog alerts to have news about the latest scams delivered right to your inbox at aarp.org/fraudwatchnetwork.
Troy, thank you so much for joining us.
Daniel, it's an absolute pleasure. I want to thank you for allowing me and providing some time for us to share this survey and to provide resources for those veterans and my former colleagues who have protected us in our country. Thank you.
That's a lot to think about to stay safe online. Now for defense dollars. The United Arab Emirates is looking to France for fighter jets and helicopters. The French Armed Forces Ministry said the UAE is buying 80 upgraded Rafale fighters for $18 billion. That's the largest French export contract. France also announced a deal with the UAE to sell 12 Airbus-built combat helicopters. This was welcome news by France, who lost out to the United States on a $66 billion contract for 12 submarines. A former Air Force acquisitions chief may become the Pentagon's top weapons buyer. William LaPlante is currently the president and CEO of Dapper Laboratory, and the Biden administration has nominated him to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. LaPlante served as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisitions for 3 years, leaving in 2015. LaPlante was involved in the B-21 Raider and the KC-46 acquisitions during his tenure. And that's it for your headlines this week. When we come back, should you sign up for those store credit cards to get a big discount on a purchase? Navy Federal's finance expert has some advice. On this edition of Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack walks you through whether you should sign up for a tempting credit card offer at the register when doing some holiday shopping.
Most store credit cards come with instant discounts and perks at the register. The offer to save money is tempting, especially during the holidays. So should you go for it or not? Well, it depends on how you manage your money. It's the same as applying for any credit card. Don't use credit if you don't have the funds to repay it, period. That way you stay out of heavy debt. So if you're opening a store credit card to get a one-time discount, be sure you've got the cash to pay it off quickly. Store cards have higher interest rates, so that big discount could soon be overcome by finance charges the longer you wait to pay off your balance. And the higher rate applies to all your purchases beyond the holidays too. So keep purchases to a minimum on that card to avoid overpaying in the long run. It's always best to shop card rates and perks before you get to the department store. A rewards card from a trusted financial institution can be a great way to help manage your spending and make the most of your purchases all year round. You're the curator of your credit score. Vet all your options before you shop so you can keep the happy in your holidays.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage, be sure to check out our headlines online at Army, Navy, Air Force, and MarineCorpsTimes.com and DefenseNews.com. And to receive a list of our top stories in your inbox every weekday morning, subscribe to our Early Bird Brief and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. When we come back, a look at the Army's version of the show Shark Tank to develop new ideas for the force. Welcome back. The military is always looking for innovation, ways to be more efficient, solve a problem, or create a more deadly force. One section of the Army has taken this further by coming up with its own version of the entrepreneur/startup show Shark Tank. That's all to let troops showcase their innovative ideas. It's the Dragon's Lair, and Miltech's Todd South gives us the scoop on what it's all about.
So this week, instead of talking about a particular piece of technology, we're going to talk about a technology hotbed that's come out of the Army. So about a year ago, the 18th Airborne Corps, which is the group that handles all the airborne units across the Army, think 101st Airborne, 82nd Airborne Division, started what's called the Dragon Lair Innovation Challenge. The Dragon's Lair essentially is like a Shark Tank style competition. Soldiers write in a proposal, very summarized version of a piece of technology or way of or practice of doing things that would improve things for soldiers or improve things by saving money or having kind of tech fixes.
Now we have an excellent view of a multifunctional display on which to conduct our analysis.
The leadership then sifts through all those applications, all those pitches essentially, and picks about 5 people to come to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the headquarters of the 18th Airborne Corps. Some have to do it remote, obviously, for certain reasons. They then pitch their ideas to this board of experts, both in the subject matter they're looking at, whatever kind of technology it is, and of course Army leadership that might see an application for this in a tactical way or an operational way. One of the early winners of the competition about a year ago was a simple attachment to a forklift that would allow it to lift things like generators or air conditioning units and move them around a motor pool around a lot, rather than having to take a Humvee, drive it all the way in, hook it up to the trailer hitch, and then move that piece of equipment maybe a few hundred feet. That was one piece of simple technology that got some attention very early in the competition about a year ago. Another one involved planning, essentially. An Army officer came up with an idea to build an app that would allow people to select range training times to make sure that they're not conflicting with other units for the range, but also to input data while on the range into a smartphone app so that all that data was readily available and back to headquarters immediately, instead of bringing a whole bunch of paper like it's 1985 and sitting down at some terminal at the headquarters to type it all in late at night after the training range is done. A pretty interesting tech solution that won the most recent competition this fall was from an Army Black Hawk helicopter pilot who also has developed this as a side business potential company for an augmented reality video feedback system for pilot error, pilot correction. So essentially this pilot had flown civilian side and also flown, of course, in the military, and really didn't like how he was getting feedback without having someone sitting right next to him physically in the cockpit. Oftentimes that's just not an option. So he created a camera system using augmented reality tools to see the cockpit display, record that information, and calibrate what exactly is going on with the controls as he's using them for, say, landings, takeoffs, or certain maneuvers. And that information is immediately fed back, almost like an instant replay in a football game, so that the pilot can learn from their errors and correct themselves for the next flight. Now, the most recent competition just closed. Now, one of the competitors who did make the finals but hasn't gone through the final exposition portion is actually a Navy Lieutenant Commander. That's because the Army just opened this up to all the services. So this Navy Lieutenant Commander developed what's called an augmented reality bridge. A bridge on a ship is basically where the commander sits and sees what's going on and controls all the stations. Now, there's a lot of blind spots on a ship, whether it's on the port side or starboard side, fore, aft, bow or stern. There's different places they can't actually see all the time. But by equipping different parts with cameras and putting on augmented reality goggles, a commander can now see all over the ship at any time and communicate with watch standards in different parts of the ship and different areas of the ship for security reasons and for maintenance concerns. And this just isn't just an opportunity for soldiers to give great ideas and see them run off and be implemented. Obviously that's the most important part, but soldiers also get a little bit of a benefit from it. They get 4 days free Liberty Pass, they get a meritorious service medal, and the Army training school of their choice. The Black Hawk helicopter pilot I mentioned earlier chose military freefall school, so he'll be not just flying helicopters, but soon jumping out of airplanes. For Military Times, this has been Todd South.
Thanks, Todd. That's all we have time for this week. Please visit us on militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more coverage. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.